So recently I did a poll on LinkedIn where I asked supply chain professionals like you on which topics are you most interested in. And a huge majority came back and said that they are interested in knowing more about KPIs in supply chain. In this video, I will cover the most critical key performance indicators or KPIs which are used in supply chain jobs. And in order to do that, I'm going to be using the supply chain operations reference, which is a model very heavily used in the industry and also referenced in the APICS supply chain professional programs. I will cover these KPIs in the buckets of reliability and service, asset management or cash, cost, and responsiveness and agility. My name is Jamil Hai, and I've been working in supply chain management positions across South Asia, Middle East, and North America for the last 20 years. And my mission is to help you build real-life supply chain skills for your job and career that they don't teach you in college. And if you are applying for a supply chain job anytime soon, you should definitely book a session with me because I will take your resume, the job description you're applying for, and give you some laser-guided tips and coaching which will help you maximize your chances of success. And you can see some testimonials from successful candidates on my LinkedIn profile, where you can also book your next session by clicking on the link that you see on the screen. So let's start by looking at the 4 buckets I was talking about earlier. The first KPI bucket is reliability and service. The second one is asset management and cash. The third one is responsiveness and agility. And the fourth one is cost. Now you can see in this graphic that I have put these 4 KPI buckets on 2 different sides of a seesaw. And as long as these KPIs are balanced, which means that the seesaw is neither going up or down, it's balanced, that's when we can say that the supply chain is in equilibrium. And this is what exactly we want. Because if you try to squeeze cash a lot, which sometimes finance departments in the companies tend to do, then that can really throw the reliability and service into the danger mode. Similarly, if you try to be super resilient and super responsive, that can sometimes result into unwanted costs as well. Once again, throwing the seesaw out of balance. And we saw the seesaw going out of balance during COVID because when the pandemic started, it started with China stopping their ports, and that resulted into a lot of shortage of containers, materials, raw materials, finished goods, and whatnot. And that created a huge shortage of products in all shapes and forms, which resulted in the resilience and responsiveness of the supply chain going in the danger zone. And that automatically pushed the costs up. That resulted into the prices of items going up, and everybody was saying that, oh, this is a supply chain crisis, when that is true. And therefore, we saw instances where, let's say, the container cost for a transatlantic container, which used to be $700 or $800 before COVID, went up to as high as $3,500 as well, which forced companies to increase prices, which led to inflation, and then eventually the central banks around the world had to come and react and increase interest rates. So after a huge pandemic, which was a medical pandemic related to a disease, the world went through another pandemic, which is an economic pandemic, which we are still trying to get out of. And you can see supply chain was so much at the center of this, and that's why these KPIs are so important. Now let's go through these buckets one by one and cover the KPIs which are covered in each of them. The first bucket I'm going to talk about is the reliability and service bucket. Now, if you look at the supply chain operations reference model, this section is called reliability only, but I'm adding service to it because the more reliable your supply chain is, the happier your customer will be with that service. And therefore, a lot of service KPIs are covered in this bucket. And the first and the most important one, which has a lot of sub KPIs underneath it, is the famous KPI called perfect order. Now, what is perfect order? A perfect order is a perfect order, as it says. But what does that really mean? It means that firstly, you have satisfied the quantity that you promised to your customer. So let's say if a customer ordered 10 apples, you are providing them 10 apples. That means this is the first component of perfect order. Now, this component itself is called case fill rate or fill rate, because customer asked for 10 apples, you gave them 10 apples, 10 divided by 10 is 1, which is 100%. So your case fill in this case is 100%. But it doesn't mean that your perfect order is 100 as well. Why? Because let's move to the second component of perfect order, which is delivery on time. So let's say your customer asked for 10 apples to be delivered at 11 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and you delivered it at 11 a.m. on Saturday morning. That means your on time was 100% as well. If you delivered it at 12 o'clock or 10 o'clock or 6 o'clock, then your on time was 0%. So that's the second component. And a combination of these two sub KPIs is called on time and in full, or also known as OTIF. But once again, remember, 100% OTIF doesn't necessarily mean that the order is perfect. Why? Because we have got another component, which is invoice accuracy. So you were asked to deliver 10 apples at 11 a.m. You delivered them, but on the invoice, you said these are 12 apples or 8 apples. In that case, your invoice accuracy is 0. And once again, although you had 100% on time and in full, but your perfect order is 0%. Now, let's say you delivered 10 apples at 11 a.m. and the invoice said, I'm delivering you 10 apples and the right price is there. Then your invoice accuracy is 100% as well. But it still doesn't mean that your order is perfect, because that takes me to the last part of perfect order, which is no damages. Because let's say you delivered 10 apples at 11 a.m. Invoice was accurate, but 2 of those apples were damaged during transportation. So in this case, your damages KPI goes to 0 and makes your perfect order 0 as well. If you have damages on your shipment, then your perfect order is 0 again. So let's now say we have delivered 10 apples at 11 a.m. with the right and accurate invoice and there were no damages. Now this order is a perfect order and you will get 100%. One more thing to keep in mind, that the customers could penalize you if you are not delivering perfect orders to them. Because for example, a big retailers like Walmart or Costco or Carrefour would penalize you, or will charge you compliance fees and those kind of things if your orders are consistently imperfect, which means, going back to our seesaw analogy, if you are not delivering perfect orders, which means that your reliability is going in the danger zone, your cost will go up because the customer is finding you, once again, taking your supply chain out of that equilibrium. Now, there are a few more KPIs that I want to cover in this reliability and service bucket, which are more related to the accuracy of your supply chain. And the first one and the foremost one there is forecast accuracy. How accurately are you able to forecast your demand? Now, why is this accuracy so important? Because if you, let's say, going back to our apples example, if your lead time to get those apples, and we'll talk about lead time by the way later on as well, because you might be wondering what is lead time. So hold on and keep watching this video till the end. But on forecast accuracy, let's say you are supposed to deliver those 10 apples and your total lead time to secure those apples from the farm and process them and transport them is, let's say, 10 days. And 10 days ago, if you did not forecast those 10, let's say you forecast 15 or 5, in both cases you will have a problem, because if you forecast 5 only got 5, you will not get your perfect order because you only have 5 to deliver now. So your case fill rate is going to go down. Similarly, if you got 15 or 20, maybe it could be fine, because if those apples are not going bad or rancid. But if those apples have a shelf life which is very short, then you need to get very close to the exact demand. Otherwise, those apples will go bad, and that will increase your inventory cost and your disposal cost of the damaged product and so on. One of the other reasons why forecast accuracy is important, because if you have a very unreliable forecast, you will end up keeping a lot of safety stock because your supply chain is not very reliable. And though that safety stock will reduce your amount of inventory turns, which is another KPI we are going to cover very soon. The other accuracy KPI here is the production accuracy. How accurate is your production? So for example, when you make a production plan of producing 10 units of something, do you always produce those 10, or do you end up producing 11, or you end up producing 8? Because once again, in both those cases, you have a problem, because you could be either impacting your fill rate if you are not producing up to the mark, or if you're overproducing, then you may have issues with your inventory going obsolete and so on. Similarly, there is another accuracy KPI, which is your transportation accuracy. Transportation accuracy is calculated by the number of days your trucks were supposed to take on the road. Let's say, for example, if you were delivering from Toronto to Chicago, and let's say the transit time is 2 days, but your truck took 3 days, or it actually went really fast and it delivered 1.5 days. In both those cases, it's a problem, because your supply chain is not as predictive or not as accurate as you had put on your assumptions. So once again, a combination of your forecast accuracy, your production accuracy, and your transportation accuracy. The more accurate you are, the less stock you'll carry, which means you will turn around your inventory faster and your costs will be low. But if you have inaccuracies anywhere in your supply chain, that will of course risk your fill rate, which we talked about earlier. At the same time, it will also force you to keep more inventory throughout your network and increase your costs. Now let's look at the next bucket, which is also known as asset management or cash bucket. Now, why is asset management equal to cash? Now, this is where the love-hate relationship between finance and supply chain starts, because in most companies, the biggest amount of cash which is stuck in an organization's cash flow is in inventory. There are some examples where you could be holding almost 90% of your cash flow in inventory costs. And inventory itself is an asset, right? So therefore, you need to make sure that you are maximizing the efficiency of that asset, because the faster your inventory moves throughout the network, the more efficient and less costly your supply chain is going to be. Now, in order to understand the concept of asset efficiency or cash efficiency in supply chain, we need to understand a concept which is called cash to cash cycle time. You may have heard this term. Now, what is cash to cash cycle time? Cash to cash cycle time basically means that how fast you turn around your cash in supply chain, or in other words, how much cash is tied up in your supply chain. Now, how do you calculate this? And this is where we get into some more KPIs that feed into this cash to cash cycle time KPI itself. So the cash to cash cycle time is calculated by adding your days of raws and packs inventory, your days of finished goods inventory, your days of sales outstanding, and subtracting them with your days of payables outstanding. Now, what does all this mean? Let's try to understand this with an example. Let's say you're a company that makes tires. So you have 30 days of raw materials of items like rubber or other resins which go into tire manufacturing. And let's say the value of those 30 days of raw materials is equal to about $10 million. Then you also are carrying 30 days of finished goods of tires, which the value is around $20 million. Now note that I'm using these numbers very carefully, because 30 days of raw materials, if that is equal to 10 million, then 30 days of finished goods in most cases will always be more than 10 million, because when you convert your raws inventory into a finished goods inventory, you are adding value to it, right? So the value of your finished goods is always more than the value of your raws and packs. Now, let's say you have got 30 days of sales outstanding, or DSO. Now, what does DSO mean? DSO means that this is the number of days after which your customer pays you. So let's say you are selling your tires to Costco and you have an agreement with Costco that Costco is going to pay you after 30 days of receipt. So in this case, your days of sales outstanding, which is kind of your receivable from Costco, is about 30 days. And let's say the value of those 30 days of sales is about 30 million. Now, once again, I'm carefully using the number of 30 million, because if your finished goods are valued at 20 million and they are 30 days, so we are not changing the reference point here, your days of sales outstanding value will be higher because you are actually selling to Costco on your sale price. So your gross margin, net margin, all the margins are included in that. So if 30 days of finished goods is equal to about $20 million, your 30 days of sales will definitely be more than 20 million. So we are just using 30 million as an example here. So now we have got 30 days of raws and packs, 30 days of finished goods, 30 days of sales outstanding, which is my receivable from my customer. And let's say my payable to my supplier. So, whichever company or group of companies I purchased my rubber and resins and all the other raw materials from, my payable to them is about 60 days. And because the value of 30 days of my raws and packs inventory was about $10 million, that means that my payable to my suppliers is about $20 million. So if you put all this together, your cash to cash cycle time comes out to be about 30 days, which basically means that your operation has got about 30 days of cash tied up at any given point in time. And if you want to look at the value of what that 30 days is, you do the same thing with the values that we put against each of those. So you had $10 million of raw materials, you had $20 million of finished goods, you had $30 million of outstanding sales, and then you had $20 million of payables to your suppliers, which means that you've got about $40 million of cash tied up in this operation. And this is exactly why supply chain managers are always challenged to keep lower inventories, because the lower inventory you keep in your supply chain, the lower your cash to cash cycle time will be. In fact, there are models today where the cash to cash cycle time for some companies could be negative. One example that comes to mind off the top of my head is how Amazon does its business. So for example, when you purchase something from Amazon, they will charge your credit card right away, right? Which means that their days of sales outstanding is almost zero because they are getting the cash as soon as they made the sale. So there are no payment terms in that case, right? So they are getting money from the customers right off the bat. The inventory Amazon typically keeps, let's say you are selling stuff to Amazon through the Amazon FBA program, they will actually charge the sellers for the inventory holding cost and all those kind of things. And of course, the seller is responsible for the inventory cost itself, which means that they are not carrying any raws and packs or finished good inventory yet, because that inventory is kind of owned by the FBA suppliers, right? So the supplier is kind of owning the inventory, which means that there is no raws and packs or finished goods inventory on their books, and they are getting their cash right off the bat, and they would give money back to their sellers or the FBA sellers in this case, let's say once a month, right? I don't know what are the latest frequencies of payment, but let's say it's 30 days. In this case, you can see that Amazon could be operating on a negative 20 days of cash to cash cycle time, which is fantastic. Another example of a negative cash to cash cycle, which is kind of not exactly supply chain but linked to it, is when you buy these loyalty cards. I got a message from one of my friends recently that, hey, did you know that Starbucks is like a bank, because when we preload our money on their loyalty cards, they are sitting on that cash because we don't use that money until we are actually buying coffee. And I said, yeah, absolutely, that's true. And that's another example of a negative cash to cash cycle time, because let's say you're a loyalty customer of Starbucks or Tim Hortons, and you say, okay, this month I'm going to buy $100 worth of coffee, and you buy $100 gift card because of course you have been incentivized by their loyalty program, and you will get maybe your 100th coffee will be free and all of those kind of things. But the advantage of that is that Tim Hortons is getting $100 of cash right off the bat without even giving you a single cup of coffee, and as you consume, they will be charging you from that card. So that's another example where the cash to cash cycle time in an operation could be negative. Now this leads to another important KPI I want to cover at this stage, which is inventory turns. A lot of times in the job interviews, you could be asked, okay, what were the inventory turns in your operation? And a lot of supply chain managers, both junior and senior, sometimes get completely baffled when they hear that question. What does that mean, inventory turns? Because everybody is used to looking at inventory either in terms of days of stock or in terms of value. So yeah, I understand if you're talking about 30 days of stock or $10 million or $15 million or whatever. But then what does inventory turns mean? Inventory turns basically is a different way of looking at your inventory from the days of stock perspective. So if your inventory is 1 month, or let's say 30 days, your inventory turns in that case are 12, because you are turning around that inventory 12 times a year. That's what inventory turns really means. So if you are, for example, keeping 15 days of inventory, then your inventory turns are like 24. Right? Or if you're keeping 7 days of inventory, then it's double of that. So in an efficient supply chain, ideally you would want to have lower days of stock, or in other words, you would want to have higher inventory turns. And this makes a lot of sense even when you just step back and think about it as a consumer, right? Higher inventory turns means that your inventory is turning around really fast, which means that you're producing, you are shipping, and you are really fast in terms of turning around your supply chain. And who would not want a supply chain like that? And the restaurants are a great analogy for this, right? Because would you want to go to a restaurant where the inventory is turning around really fast, which means that the moment you place the order, within a few minutes it's served. There are a lot of customers, which means that they might not be sitting on a lot of stock in their kitchen. Or you would want to go to a restaurant where you walk in and you see like 5 days old food item, then you will be saying, oh, this doesn't even look fresh to me, right? Because in that case, their inventory turns are very low, or in other words, their days of stock are really high. So I think that's a very good analogy to understand the relationship between days of stock and inventory turns. Now let's move to the third bucket, which is the cost bucket. Now the cost bucket has two major components, and within those there are certain KPIs involved. The first and the most important one in the cost world in supply chain is something called cost of goods sold, or COGS. Now, why are COGS so important? Because COGS have a direct impact on your margins and on your profit. Because typically in companies, your gross profit is equal to your revenue minus your COGS. Now, of course, I know I'm oversimplifying this. There are other elements, and we are not going to get into net profit calculations and so on. But at a very high level, your gross profit is equal to, let's say, the money you collect when you make a sale minus the cost of the item that you sold. So let's say if you are, for example, selling a lemonade, which is the classical supply chain 101 example, which is often quoted, then let's say you sold 10 glasses of lemonade for $2 each, which means your revenue was $20, and the cost of making each glass of lemonade was $1. That means your COGS in that case was $10. So your gross profit in that case is going to be $10, which is 20 minus 10, right? Therefore, COGS is such an important component. But in reality, in supply chain, the COGS are not as simple as that lemonade glass, because there are a number of elements that go into the calculation of COGS, which we'll see now. Now, how is COGS calculated? Now, COGS is calculated by taking a snapshot of your opening inventory, which is the value of your goods when you started the month, let's say. Then you add to it the amount of volume you purchased from your suppliers. So all the raw materials, and then the value of your finished goods and all of that stuff. What was the total value of the purchases made during the month, and then you subtract from it the ending inventory of the month. Let's look at an example. Let's say you are running a ketchup business. So in your ketchup business, your raw materials are basically tomatoes and maybe some other ingredients which help you convert those tomatoes into tomato ketchup. So let's say your opening inventory of all your tomatoes and the raw materials was $10 million. And during the month, you purchased another $5 million worth of tomatoes and other raw materials and so on. And your ending inventory was $8 million of tomatoes and raw materials. So in that case, your cost of goods sold is going to be around $7 million. And imagine if your revenue for that month was $17 million. So you sold your tomato ketchup, of course, for a much higher price than the value of the tomato ketchup itself. So let's say you sold about $17 million worth of tomato ketchup during that month. Then your gross profit is going to be $10 million. So basically, it's the cost of goods that were consumed during the month, because you purchased 5 million, but then additionally, you also used 2 million from your existing inventory, because remember, you started the month with 10 million and you ended the month at 8 million, which means that you actually depleted into your stocks about 2 million. So your that 2 million plus the 5 million that you purchased is your cost of goods sold. Now, the second bucket other than COGS in the supply chain cost bucket is the supply chain costs themselves. What do I mean by that? So there are different elements of supply chain where you need to cost out. For example, what is the cost to plan? So what is the cost of your planning systems? What are the salaries, wages, and benefits of your planning team? And all those kind of things related to planning. So any cost related to planning will go into cost to plan. Then you have cost to source, which is your supplier cost, your contract management cost, or all those purchasing and procurement related costs are in the cost to source. And then you have got the cost to make, which is typically the biggest bucket in the supply chain costs, because that is where you are manufacturing. So your factory costs, your fixed costs in the factories, your variable costs in the factories. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, because I could make a completely separate video on manufacturing costs. And if you're interested in that, let me know in comments, and I'm going to make a separate video on manufacturing costs, because manufacturing cost is a beast on its own. And then we get into cost to deliver, which is the cost for which supply chain is held the most accountable. And this is the cost of your logistics. And sometimes it's called the logistics conversion cost. And what do those logistics costs include? They include the freight cost. Now, freight cost could be the freight inbound, which is the freight to bring your raw materials into your factory. And it could be freight outbound as well, because that typically manufacturers are responsible for delivering to their customers. Then you have got the storage and handling, which is typically all your warehousing costs go underneath that bucket, because your storage is your warehouse cost. And typically companies don't build their own warehouses, right? They would have warehouses outsourced to third-party logistics companies, and they would have a charging model with them. It could be a cost plus model or any other financial models that you would agree in your contract. So all your storage cost for your pallets and your products goes on the storage, and then the cost to handle the product, right? The cost to receive, offload the truck and take that pallet or take those products to the shelf, and then picking them up when the order comes, and then putting them on another truck as it goes out. All of those are handling costs, which go into logistics costs as well. And then you've got duties and documentation, which of course, especially when you are dealing with cross-border logistics, this is a huge component. Sometimes duties can be very, very high, right? Really depending on where you are importing from, what you are importing, what kind of tariffs are there. In North America, of course, we are blessed because we have got something called USMCA, which is the United States, Canada and Mexico agreement, where there are a lot of different products on which these three countries collaborate with each other, and there is a good duty and tax regime. But of course, at the same time, sometimes USMCA is also used as a political lever, as we have seen in the past. So duties and documentation, of course, are very important. And then you've got your overhead costs, which is your salaries, wages, benefits, contractual costs, and so on. And then lastly, one more cost, which is becoming very, very important, especially with e-commerce and with the changing consumer behaviors, is cost to return. Now, what is cost to return? Cost to return is the cost to process the return of a product. Now, imagine like sometimes, people will buy 3 or 4 different types of products and they probably only need one. And in that case, for the manufacturer, if they are taking care of the return cost, which most companies are doing nowadays, just because Amazon has made it so easy for consumers to return products, and every other manufacturer has to follow suit, because otherwise the customer will always compare the Amazon experience with the other experience as well. Therefore, now companies and supply chains need to bake in the cost of return. So for example, if somebody wants to return the product, you need to make sure that you are providing them with a QR code or with a set of details on how they could return those packages. So all those costs will go into cost of return. And this is where, once again, Amazon is a great example, because they have simplified the life of the consumer so much that the return process has become very easy. So for example, until very recently, if you had to return something to Amazon, you would want to put it back into a box like this and then put the label, print the label, and then go to, let's say in Canada Post, or in other parts of the world, whatever your best courier option is, and then you would have to drop the package. Now it's super easy because you don't even need this box. So this box is gone, and you just need to basically get the QR code, which is on your return label, and then just take the item. No need to package it, no need to put it in any boxes or something, and you just give it to the courier company which is involved, and they have now their own bags or boxes, which has really made the return journey so easy. And that is why this cost to return is such an important aspect of supply chain costs nowadays. Cost to return is also known as the reverse logistics cost, right? Because reverse logistics is a very important concept nowadays, just because returns have become so important. And we can make a separate video on reverse logistics if you're interested. Let me know in chat. And finally, we get to the responsiveness and agility bucket. Now, I'm not going to cover all the KPIs in this bucket, but I will touch on some of the most critical ones. The first one is the customer lead time, which is basically how fast your customer gets the product when they place an order. So going back to my Amazon examples, if you're a Prime customer, your customer lead time is typically 1 day, or sometimes it could be a few hours if you are on the same day delivery. But of course, in most of the manufacturing world, it's not as short as 1 day, because customer lead time can be very long. For example, if you're ordering a car, right, you must have experienced this yourself, because most manufacturing companies now work on make to order. I was recently visiting the factories of Toyota and Ford, and I've made some LinkedIn posts, which you can check out on my profile again. And both those companies are fully on make to order now, which means that they don't even make a single car if there is no customer order. The advantage of that approach is, of course, that there are no waste costs, and they are not making cars which the customers don't need, because every single car is on an order. So there's a customer waiting for that car. The problem is that there is a customer waiting for that car, which means that the lead time for that customer to wait is sometimes as long as 3, 4, 5 months. So because in that case, you would have your order processing time, which is basically how much time it takes to process the order and make sure that the product is created. Because sometimes if you are on a make to order operation like that, you place an order today, so you are already, let's say 30-40 days behind the queue, because let's say you ordered a Ford F-150 or a Toyota Corolla, then that car is behind those 30 days worth of orders. So you would at least take 30 days to get your car. So that is your order processing time. The next one is your pick, pack, and ship times. So how much time does it take for the manufacturer to pick your order and then make sure that it's packaged well and it's shipped out? So that's your pick and ship time. And then you've got your transit time, right? So for example, going back to the car example, let's say you live in Toronto, Canada, and you placed an order for a car that is manufactured in Japan. So now when the order is shipped, it's not going to come to your doorstep the next day, right? It's going to take, let's say, a month on a ship or something like that, because mostly cars are not transported by air, otherwise it will be very expensive. So you have got like your sea shipment time. So all of those three components, your processing time, your pick, pack, and ship time, and your transit time, added together are your lead time. Similarly, there is another KPI called your production cycle time. How frequently do you produce certain items? So let's go back to our tire example. So let's say you are in that tire company where for certain types of cars where there is high demand, you produce those tires once every 2 days. But let's say the same company also makes tires for tractors. But because the demand is lower and there are fewer customers buying tractor tires, you only produce tractor tires once every 3 months. In that case, your cycle time for producing tractors will be much higher than the cycle time of producing regular car tires. And once again, this is a KPI which will have an impact on the inventory you carry, because if your cycle times are longer, so going back to the tractor example, then you will be carrying overall higher inventory, because you will at least be carrying, let's say if your cycle time is 3 months, you will be carrying at least 45 days of inventory as cycle stock. Because when you will do your production run, you will go back to almost 3 months of inventory, because you need to satisfy that demand for the next 3 months. And by the time your next production run happens, which is basically the classical supply chain planning sawtooth wave, you will come back to 0 days of stock, and then you will produce again. Which means that if you look at the average inventory during those 3 months, it's about 45 days of inventory. So this is why cycle time is so important, because the shorter your cycle time is, the smaller inventory you will keep across your supply chain, and it will be less costly. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I've also made videos on topics like, do certifications really matter in supply chain, or procurement manager job interviews, which you can watch by clicking over here. Keep watching.